Hey, you listen. I know not that many people listen, but y'all gonna get tired of seeing me today. I've been on every little bit. Okay, I'm like 35 minutes away from my live, so we'll see how much we can get rid of 10. Then I'll have to come on later tonight, maybe in the chair with my feet up to read the other book, Anne, Green Gables. You notice I've just been doing WH for Wuthering Heights and AGG for Anne of Green Gables. I'm tired of typing all that. Chapter 10. A charming introduction to a hermit's life. 4 weeks' torture, tossing, and sickness. Oh, these bleak winds and bitter northern skies and impassable roads and dilatory county surgeons. And oh, this dearth of the human physiognomy, and worse than all, the terrible intimidation of Kenneth that I need not expect to be out of doors till spring. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Mr. Heathcliff has just honored me with a call. About 7 days ago he sent me a brace of grouse. The last of the season. Scoundrel. He's not altogether guiltless in this illness of mine, and that I had a great mind to tell him, but alas, how could I offend a man who was charitable enough to sit at my bedside a good hour and talk on some other subject than pills and droughts, blisters and leeches? This is quite an easy interval. I am too weak to read, yet I feel as I could enjoy something interesting. Why not have up Mrs. Dean to finish her tale? I can recollect its chief incidents as far as she had gone. Yes, I remember her hero had run off and never been heard of for 3 years. And the heroine was married. I'll ring. She'll be delighted to find me capable of talking cheerfully. Mrs. Dean came. It wants 20 minutes, sir, to taking the medicine, she commenced. Away with it, I replied. I desire to have... The doctor says you must drop the powders. With all my heart. Don't interrupt me. Come and take your seat here. Keep your fingers from that bitter phalanx of vials. Draw your knitting out of your pocket. That will do. Now continue the history of Mr. Heathcliff, from where you left off to the present day. Did he finish his education on the continent and come back a gentleman? Or did he get a Caesar's place at college, or escape to America and earn honors by drawing blood from his foster country, or make a fortune more promptly on English highways? He may have done a little in all these vocations, Mr. Lockwood, but I couldn't give my word for any. I stated before that I didn't know how he gained his money. Neither am I aware of the means he took to raise his mind from the savage ignorance into which it was sunk. But, with your leave, I'll proceed in my own fashion, if you think it will amuse and not weary you. Are you feeling better this morning? Much. That's good news. I got Miss Catherine. So here we go back into the story again. I got Miss Catherine and myself to Thrushcross Grange, and to my agreeable disappointment she behaved infinitely better than I dared to expect. She seemed almost over fond of Mr. Linton, and even to his sister she showed plenty of affection. They were both very attentive to her comfort, certainly. It was not the thorn bending to the honeysuckles, but the honeysuckles embracing the thorn. There were no mutual concessions. One stood erect and the others yielded. And who can be ill-natured and bad-tempered when they encounter neither opposition nor indifference? I observed that Mr. Edgar had a deep-rooted fear of ruffling her humor. He concealed it from her, but if ever he heard me answer sharply or saw any other servant grow cloudy at some imperious order of hers, he would show his trouble by a frown of displeasure that never darkened on his own account. He many a time spoke sternly to me about my pertness, and averred that the stab of a knife could not inflict a worse pang than he suffered at seeing his lady vexed. Not to grieve a kind master, I learned to be less touchy, and for the space of half a year, the gunpowder lay as harmless as sand because no fire came near to explode it. Catherine had seasons of gloom and silence now and then. They were respected and sympathizing silence by her husband, who ascribed them to an alteration in her constitution produced by her perilous illness, as she was never subject to depression of spirits before. The return of sunshine was welcomed by an answering sunshine from him. I believe I may assert that they were really in possession of deep and growing happiness. It ended, well, we must be for ourselves in the long run. The mild and generous are only more justly selfish than the domineering, and it ended when circumstances caused each to feel that the one's interest was not the chief consideration in the other's thoughts. On a mellow evening in September, I was coming from the garden with a heavy basket of apples which I had been gathering. It had got dusk, and the moon looked over the high wall of the court, causing undefined shadows to lurk in the corners of the numerous projecting portions of the building. I set my burden on the house steps by the kitchen door and lingered to rest, and drew in a few more breaths of the soft, sweet air. My eyes were on the moon and my back to the entrance when I heard a voice behind me say, "Nellie, is that you?" It was a deep voice and foreign in tone, yet there was something in the manner of pronouncing my name which made it sound familiar. I turned about to discover who spoke, fearfully, for the doors were shut and I had seen nobody on approaching the steps. Something stirred in the porch, and moving nearer, I distinguished a tall man dressed in dark clothes with dark face and hair. He leant against the side and held his fingers on the latch as if intending to open for himself. "Who can it be?" I thought. "Mr. Earnshaw?" Oh, no, the voice has no resemblance to his. "I have waited here an hour," he resumed, while I continued staring, "and the whole of that time all round has been as still as death. I dared not enter. You do not know me? Look, I'm not a stranger." A ray fell on his features. The cheeks were sallow and half covered with black whiskers, the brows lowering, the eyes deep set and singular. I remembered the eyes. "What?" I cried, uncertain whether to regard him as a worldly visitor, and I raised my hands in amazement. "What? You? Come back? Is it really you? Is it?" "Yes, Heathcliff," he replied, glancing from me up to the windows, which reflected a score of glittering moons, but showed no lights from within. "Are they at home? Where is she? Nellie, you are not glad. You needn't be so disturbed. Is she here? Speak. I want to have one word with her, your mistress." "Go and say some person from Gimmerton desires to see her." "How will she take it?" I exclaimed. "What will she do?" "The surprise bewilders me. It will put her out of her head. And you are Heathcliff, but altered. Nay, there's no comprehending it. Have you been for a soldier?" "Go and carry my message," he interrupted impatiently. "I'm in hell till you do." He lifted the latch, and I entered, but when I got to the parlor where Mr. and Mrs. Linton were, I could not persuade myself to proceed. At length I resolved on making an excuse to ask if they would have the candles lighted, and I opened the door. They sat together in a window whose lattice lay back against the wall and displayed beyond the garden trees, in the wild green park, the valley of Gimmerton, with a long line of mist winding nearly to its top. For very soon after you pass the chapel, as you may have noticed, the Sough, S-O-U-G-H, that runs from the marshes joins a beck which follows the bend of the glen. Wuthering Heights rose from this silvery vapor, but our old house was invisible. It rather dips down on the other side. Both the room and its occupants and the scene they gazed on looked wonderfully peaceful. wondrously peaceful. I shrank reluctantly from performing my errand, and was actually going away, leaving it unsaid after having put my question about the candles, when a sense of my folly compelled me to return and mutter, "A person from Gimmerton wishes to see you, ma'am." "What does he want?" asked Mrs. Linton. I did not question him, I answered. "Well, close the curtains, Nellie," she said, "and bring up tea. I'll be back again directly." She quitted the apartment. Mr. Edgar inquired carelessly who it was. "Someone mistress does not expect," I replied. "That Heathcliff, you recollect him, sir, who used to live at Mr. Earnshaw's." "What? The gypsy, the ploughboy?" he cried. "Why did you not say so to Catherine?" "Hush, you must not call him by those names, master," I said. "She'd be sadly grieved to hear you. She was nearly heartbroken when he ran off. I guess his return will make a jubilee to her." Mr. Linton walked to a window on the other side of the room that overlooked the court. He unfastened it and leaned out. I suppose they were below, for he exclaimed quickly, "Don't stand there, love. Bring the person in, if it be any one particular." Ere long I heard the click of the latch, and Catherine flew upstairs, breathless and wild, too excited to show gladness. Indeed, by her face you would rather have surmised an awful calamity. "Oh, Edgar, Edgar," she panted, flinging her arms around his neck. "Oh, Edgar, darling, Heathcliff's come back. He is." And she tightened her embrace to a squeeze. "Well, well," cried her husband crossly, "don't strangle me for that. He never struck me as such a marvelous treasure. There's no need to be frantic." "I know you didn't like him," she answered, repressing a little the intensity of her delight. "Yet for my sake you must be friends now. Shall I tell him to come up?" "Here," he said, "into the parlor?" "Where else?" she asked. He looked vexed and suggested the kitchen as a more suitable place for him. Mrs. Linton eyed him with a droll expression, half angry, half laughing at his fastidiousness. "No," she added after a while, "I cannot sit in the kitchen. Set 2 tables here, Ellen, one for your master and Miss Isabella, being gentry, the other for Heathcliff and myself, being of the lower orders. Will that please you, dear, or must I have a fire lighted elsewhere? If so, give directions. I'll run down and secure my guest. I'm afraid the joy is too great to be real." She was about to dart off again, but Edgar arrested her. "You bid him step up," he said, addressing me, "and Catherine, try to be glad without being absurd. The whole household need not witness the sight of your welcoming a runaway servant as a brother." I descended and found Heathcliff waiting under the porch, evidently anticipating an invitation to enter. He followed my guidance without waste of words, and I ushered him into the presence of the master and mistress, whose flushed cheeks betrayed signs of warm talking, but the lady's glowed with another feeling when her friend appeared at the door. She sprang forward, took both his hands, and led him to Linton, and then she seized Linton's reluctant fingers and crushed them into his, and fully revealed by the fiery candlelight, I was amazed more than ever to behold the transformation of Heathcliff. He had grown a tall, athletic, well-formed man, beside whom my master seemed quite slender and youth-like. His upright carriage suggested the idea of his having been in the army. His countenance was much older in expression and decision of feature than Mr. Linton's. It looked intelligent and retained no marks of former degradation. A half-civilized ferocity lurked yet in the depressed brows and eyes full of black fire, but it was subdued, and his manner was even dignified, quite divested of roughness, though stern for grace. My master's surprise equaled or exceeded mine. He remained for a minute at a loss how to address the ploughboy, as he had called him. Heathcliff dropped his slight hand and stood looking at him coolly till he chose to speak. "Sit down, sir," he said at length. "Mr. Linton, recalling old times, would have me give you a cordial reception, and of course I'm gratified when anything occurs to please her, Mrs. Linton. And I also, answered Heathcliff, especially if it be anything in which I have a part. I shall stay an hour or two willingly. He took a seat opposite Catherine, who kept her gaze fixed on him as if she feared he would vanish were she to remove it. He did not raise his to her often. A quick glance now and then sufficed, but it flashed back each time more confidently the undisguised delight he drank from hers. They were too much absorbed in their mutual joy to suffer embarrassment. Not so Edgar. He grew pale with pure annoyance, a feeling that reached its climax when his lady rose, and stepping across the rug, seized Heathcliff's hands again, and laughed like one beside herself. "I shall think it's a dream tomorrow," she cried. "I shall not be able to believe that I have seen, touched, and spoken to you once more. And yet, cruel Heathcliff, you don't deserve this welcome. To be absent and silent for 3 years and never to think of me." "A little more than you have thought of me," he murmured. "I heard of your marriage, Kathy, not long since, and while waiting in the yard below I meditated this plan just to have one glimpse of your face, a stare of surprise perhaps and pretended pleasure, afterwards settle my score with Hindley, and then prevent the law by doing execution on myself. Your welcome has put these ideas out of my mind, but beware of meeting me with another aspect next time. Nay, you'll not drive me off again. You were really sorry for me, were you? Well, there was cause. I fought through a bitter life since I last heard your voice, and you must forgive me, for I struggled only for you." "Catherine, unless we are to have cold tea, please to come to the table," interrupted Linton, striving to preserve his ordinary tone and a due measure of politeness. "Mr. Heathcliff will have a long walk whereby he may lodge tonight, and I'm thirsty." She took her post before the urn, and Miss Isabella came, summoned by the bell, and then, having handed their chairs forward, I left the room. The meal hardly endured 10 minutes. Catherine's cup was never filled. She could neither eat nor drink. Edgar had made a slop in his saucer and scarcely swallowed a mouthful. Their guest did not protract his stay that evening above an hour longer. I asked as he departed if he went to Gimmerton. "No, to Wuthering Heights," he answered. "Mr. Earnshaw invited me when I called this morning." "Mr. Earnshaw invited him? And he called on Mr. Earnshaw?" I pondered this sentence painfully after he was gone. "Is he turning out a bit of a hypocrite and coming into the country to work mischief under a cloak?" I mused. I had a presentiment in the bottom of my heart that he had better have remained away. About the middle of the night I was awakened from my first nap by Mrs. Linton gliding into my chamber, taking a seat on my bedside and pulling me by the hair to rouse me. "I cannot rest, Ellen," she said, by way of apology, "and I want some living creature to keep me company in my happiness. Edgar is sulky because I'm glad of a thing that does not interest him. He refuses to open his mouth except to utter pettish, silly speeches, and he affirmed I was cruel and selfish for wishing to talk when he was so sick and sleepy. He always contrives to be sick at the least cross. I gave a few sentences of commendation to Heathcliff, and he, either for a headache or a pang of envy, began to cry, so I got up and left him. "What use is it praising Heathcliff to him?" I answered. "As lads, they had an aversion to each other, and Heathcliff would hate just as much to hear him praised. It's human nature. Let Mr. Linton alone about him, unless you would like an open quarrel between them." "But does it not show great weakness?" pursued she. I'm not envious. I never feel hurt at the brightness of Isabella's yellow hair and the whiteness of her skin, at her dainty elegance and the fondness all the family exhibit for her. Even you, Nellie, if we have a dispute sometimes, you back Isabella at once. And I yield like a foolish mother. I call her a darling and flatter her into a good temper. It pleases her brother to see us cordial, and that pleases me. But they are very much alike. They are spoiled children and fancy the world was made for their accommodation. And though I humor both, I think a smart chastisement might improve them all the same. You're mistaken, Mrs. Linton, said I. They humor you. I know what there would be to do if they did not. You can well afford to indulge their passing whims as long as their business is to anticipate all your desires. You may, however, fall out at last over something of equal consequence to both sides, and then those you term weak are very capable of being as obstinate as you. And then we shall fight to the death, shan't we, Nellie? She returned, laughing. No, I tell you, I have such faith in Linton's love that I believe I might kill him, and he wouldn't wish to retaliate. I advised her to value him the more for his affection. I do, she answered, but he needn't resort to whining for trifles. It's childish. And instead of melting into tears because I said that Heathcliff was now worthy of anyone's regard, and it would honor the first gentleman in the country to be his friend, he ought to have said it for me, and been delighted from sympathy. He must get accustomed to him, and he may as well like him, considering how Heathcliff has reason to object to him. I'm sure he behaved excellently. What do you think of his going to Wuthering Heights? I inquired. He is reformed in every respect, apparently quite a Christian, offering the right hand of fellowship to his enemies all around. He explained it, she replied. I wondered as much as you. He said he called together information concerning me from you, supposing you resided there still, and Joseph told Henley, who came out and fell to questioning him, of what he had been doing and how he had been living, and finally desired him to walk in. And guys, I have to stop there. Maybe I'll come back and finish later on after the live, or tonight, or maybe not till tomorrow, and I still have Anne to read, but it's only about 10 minutes and less than that, because I've got to get this uploaded. So see ya, I hope, shortly, live at 5. Bye-bye. Be sweet. Don't be ugly.